good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's discussion of walkers in the city. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. So you can learn more about that and buy tickets on the museum's website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So not the chat, but the Q&A box. You'll see two at the bottom. Please put them in the Q&A. So today we are so honored to be joined by Deborah Dash Moore and Diana L. Linden. Deborah is the Frederick G. L. Hutwell Professor of History and Professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She specializes in 20th century urban Jewish history. 3 of her monographs form a trilogy, moving from studying second-generation New York Jews to examining the lives of Jewish American soldiers in World War II, and culminating in a history of migration that carried big city Jews to Miami and Los Angeles after the war. GI Jews, How World War II Changed a Generation, served as the basis for a documentary. Her recent book, Walkers in the City, Jewish Street Photographers of Mid-Century New York, which we are going to talk about today, and is winner of a National Jewish Book Award, extends her interest to photography. She serves as editor-in-chief of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, a 10-volume anthology of original sources translated into English from the biblical period to 2005. Diana is an art historian who specializes in American art, including New York Jewish art and visual culture. She's the author of Ben Shah's New Deal Murals, Jewish Identity in the American Scene, and the co-editor of The Social and the Real, Political of the 1930s in the Western Hemisphere. In 2020, the Smithsonian recognized Diana for excellence in American art. She served as the visual essayist for the 3rd volume, City of Promise, A History of the Jews in New York City, with Deborah as the general editor. A 3rd-generation New Yorker who now resides in California, Diana remains a walker in the city. So you can purchase Walkers in the City at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Deborah and Diana.
Great.
Okay, I'm going to start by sharing, okay? Let's see if this works. Okay, I think we're good. All right.
I'm going to step in. The title of the book, Walkers in the City, some of you might know that it's a really clever take on Alfred Kazan's classic work, A Walker in the City, which was published in the mid-1940s, but written about the mid-1930s, so it covers the period we're talking about, the experience of walking through Brownsville, Brooklyn. The artists, photographers we're looking at today were mainly secular leftist Jews. There's a saying that with political artists, they replaced Moses with Marx, and for many of these artists, that was the case. They were involved, and we'll discuss further, with the Photo League, established in 1936, which was a cooperative, a photo club, a social mission to address through the camera lens political and racial equality, social justice, political issues that influenced what they shot. And I want to say they sought not just to represent the working and lower classes, but also to communicate to them, not just speak for, but connect with. This was a time when New York City was a Jewish city, it was the Empire City, and by the mid-20th century, second-generation Jews came to the forefront with their artistry, including their photography. The critic Max Kozloff, in trying to define what makes Jewish photography or what makes photography Jewish, said that it's important to consider the left wing, that photography as a political tool, the two were associated. And I'm going to step back now, and Deborah, the author, will take on.
Okay, so one of the things that is worth paying attention to, and I really thank you, Diana, for that introduction, is to see the other kinds of photographs that were being taken at the same time that really don't represent a walker in the city. And this Bernice Abbott photo is great in that regard, because she's taking it from a high vantage point, and she's looking south on 7th Avenue. Now, 7th Avenue in those years in the 30s was the heart of the garment district. The garment district was the economic engine of New York City. It was filled with Jews. You can't see them particularly well. They're down there in the streets. But it was a place where tens of thousands of Jewish workers, managers, owners, etc., would come every day. They take the subways from their homes in the Bronx if they were workers, if they owned companies, from their homes on the Upper West Side, or from Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan. They'd come up and they'd populate the garment district. So it's a great photo, and I really love it. Abbott is not Jewish. She came to New York City before World War I initially, and then left for Paris. And in Paris, she was an assistant to Man Ray, a Jewish photographer there, and also became very much influenced by the street photography that was going on. And when she comes back to New York in 1929, she's like, wow, this city has really changed. And that's part of what she is trying to show, because not all of her photos, of course, are up high, that she takes things from down street level, but it's a very different kind of aesthetic that she's giving us. And I thought it was good to begin here, so that when we start to look at what the Photo League people are doing, the Photo League photographers, will get a good sense of how different they are from someone like Abbott, whose book was published for the 1939 World's Fair, and was really well accepted. Yeah.
I just
Go ahead, Diana. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that she worked for the Federal Art Projects, the Farm Security Mission also, and that was an important patron to artists, helped them survive the Great Depression. We see this as a populated, busy city, but we're not seeing faces, and we'll see faces with the Photo League photos we'll be showing you. The government photographers were also given shooting scripts of what they should shoot exactly, and they were to follow that. And the Photo League had theories and ideas they shared, but they were not fulfilling a pre-planned script.
Yeah. So let's go to the cover photo, if you don't mind. It's one of my favorites. That Morris Engel takes East Side Sweet Evelyn, right around the same time as Abbott is doing her work. Engel is a teenager when he takes it. He grows up in Brooklyn, Coney Island. He discovers the Photo League. He comes there to take classes. And this photo, I think, really speaks to, in part, what the Photo League was about. This tells you it's New York City without showing you a single big building, right? It's New York City because the city is a place where people look at each other, where there are circulations of looks, where you can look at anybody and be looked at in return. And one of the reasons why I love this photo is that right in the middle of it, it says eyes examined, right? How do we look? How do we see? It's an optometrist shop. And what we see here, of course, is how men look and how women look. And men have a license to stare at women, especially heterosexual men. And women do not have a license to stare back. They know that this young woman, if she were to exchange glances with the man, it would be an invitation for something else, which she doesn't want. So what we're seeing here is the opportunities for the circulation of looks in the city, but also the constraints, the gendered constraints that existed in those years. Yeah. So let me show us another photo of a woman, this one's slightly different. Sid Grossman. So I'll just say a little bit about his background. He was one of the founders of the Photo League. So he's a little older. He's in his 20s, right? As compared to being a teenager like Engel. And he had a very rough childhood. He does end up going to City College at night, which is where he meets the other founder of the Photo League, Saul Leibson, and we'll see one of his photos shortly. And Grossman participates in what they called feature groups at the Photo League. These were collective projects designed to help explain a neighborhood to itself. And this neighborhood that he's trying to explain to itself, as it were, to the people who are living in the neighborhood, is Chelsea. It was a very poor working class neighborhood in those years. And Grossman actually fell in love with the neighborhood. He ended up getting a loft and moving there. But it was a neighborhood where a third of the apartments didn't have, toilets in it. It was really a poor neighborhood here. And this one is a photo that he takes of a woman hanging out by the subway. This is 7th Avenue subway on 23rd Street. So I don't know, Diana, if you want to add anything here.
I will. Thank you. One thing that we have this lone woman standing, perhaps waiting. This is a time, the 20s and 30s, where women are entering into the workforce. Young single women were office secretaries. We didn't say office administrators then. She might be waiting for her friends. This kind of type of look appeared in the art of Isabel Bishop and Reginald Marsh in the 30s, contemporaries. One thing I love about this is all the different typefaces. You start seeing Chelsea and Rapid Uptown. He's selecting a view. We can see how he zoomed in and just focused on the woman and all the reflections. And that's, I think, a real beauty and special to this photograph is we see the woman, we see her back, we see all the different signage, all the different typeface, and it's the spectacle of New York City.
Yeah. The reflections are so important, and they're also really challenging to take photos of, right?
Yeah.
With all that plate glass. So let's take a look at his partner. Grossman's partner was Leibson, Saul Leibson, and he took this photo again, roughly the same time, down on Hester Street. And yeah, I know that you know about the politics of CCNY, so maybe you want to say a little bit about that before I talk about the picture itself.
Oh, okay. There were alcoves in the structure, the main structure of City College, and these alcoves had different political groups a great many of which were leftist groups with their pamphlets and their posters, and they would call attention to themselves and try to recruit people. And as I already stated, the left is really central to these photographers. They were committed to communism, the analysis of the street, the analysis of social programs. I'll stop there.
Yeah. And I like this photo because, like the Engel one, what you've got here is a circulation of gazes. The person who's really in focus is the older woman who's standing on the steps with her arm sort of protectively across her chest. She's wearing a house dress, which women wore outside, and everybody else is looking at something going, happening somewhere off camera. And what's interesting, of course, is that Leibson is not interested in whatever is happening off camera, whether it's a parade or an altercation, or, I mean, we don't know. But he's interested in them and the way in which the street presents a kind of tableau that's very powerful. Now, his presence with the camera leads to some disruption. So a man walking there, the guy on the right, staring at him, and it's not a very favorable stare. It's like, what are you doing here with your camera? And this boy is more curious. There's another man, if you notice, in the corner on the left. He's coming up out of a grocery store, and he too is looking at Leibson, which makes the older man look down at him like, oh, what are you? So you really get the sense of what the city street does and what it's like. And then, of course, I love, we've got eyes again, these optometrist shops that are everywhere. Now, this one, maybe if I move my cursor, you can see, I'm not quite sure, but these are Hebrew letters, which speaks to the fact that this is a Jewish optometrist shop down on the Lower East Side. And if you look very closely, there is a man standing there, and he too is staring out. So, you know, I love this photo for all the many things that it tells us about New York City. And Leibson got into an argument at one point with Paul Strand, who's a very well-known modernist photographer who taught and gave lectures at the Photo League. And Strand said, it's two pictures, you know, it's the upper one, which is very good. And then there's the lower one with these, you know, these intrusions and where people are out of focus. And Leibson said, oh, no, you're wrong. It's one picture. And the fact that the people are there out of focus is part of what makes it so good and all. All right, so let me go on to another one here. This one by Walter Rosenblum. Now, Rosenblum discovers the Photo League in the late 30s. He's already in college. He grew up on the Lower East Side, and he's taken a class with Sid Grossman. And Grossman says, you know, okay, for a project, you know, photographs something of New York. So he thinks, you know, he'll take pictures of the East Side. And then he realizes, no, the East Side's too big. So then he says, okay, I'll take a street. I'll do Pitt Street. And they actually, the Photo League did do a project on Pitt Street. And then he comes back, he says, no, Pitt Street's also too big, just one block. And this is where you get the sense of the interactions, because Rosenblum would come back to this block day after day. He was using at this point a Voigtlander, so it was a large camera. He had to set up his tripod, and he'd take these photos. And here you get to see how the streets are gendered, right? These are men who are all hanging around the candy store, including a guy inside who's holding the door open, if you can see there. And they're all listening to this guy sound off. We don't know what he's talking about, but you can tell people have been listening because they're standing on one foot, you know, which is what you do when you're hanging out listening. And then if we look over on the left, there's a woman sitting there. on a chair, and she is absolutely not interested, right? I
Mm.
mean, this is not her world. Neither is it the world of this little boy who's hanging out, over, I think some kind, stairs down to a cellar or something like that. So, it's a piece of the Jewish world of Pitt Street that he captures here. Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
I just want to add to it. This is a large format photograph. This was 9 by 12 view. And he's focusing, as Deborah said, on his New York, his neighborhood,
Right.
the people. New York City is not iconic buildings. It's people as icons, as symbols that concern the photo league.
Right, right. And candy stores, of course, sold more than candy, right? I mean, you can tell they sell cigars and soda and, et cetera, et cetera. School supplies, it says.
Yeah.
So it was a staple of the city in those years. Okay, so now here's the photo, which is very, very different. Corsini, Italian American, also child of immigrants, goes to Stuyvesant High School, joins the Photo League, and this is one of his photos that was very controversial. Diana, you want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, this is one thing we do in art history, compare and contrast. And we've already seen several Photo League photographs. And I think you see right away that it's not an up-close view of a person. It's not about up-close people's social exchange in their setting. This is from a series of football photographs that he took, neighborhood kids, young teens, 20s, playing football. And the real picture here is the shadow. That's the story. They're elongated. He's really captured the shadow against the white line. We can even see that the third man has a hat on his head, which reflects into the shadow. We can see the football in another man, the fourth man's hand. It's about the tones that photography offers you, formal, what we call formal or aesthetic qualities, and it's a very much a modernist photograph. And in those ways, it differs from what Sid Grossman might have been doing.
Yeah, or Walter
And
Rosenblum,
others.
or
Yeah.
or Engel. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I want to take us to some women.
Good.
Okay, and this one is by Helen Levitt. It's a relatively well-known photograph here, and she's taking a picture of kids playing. The mirror that the boys are holding has broken, and they're picking up shards of glass, which is a relatively dangerous occupation, right? With this broken mirror. But it captures the texture of the neighborhood, which is up in the Spanish Harlem, Spanish and Italian Harlem there. And you can see it's a mixed crowd of boys. Some of them have a little more money than others, but you can tell by the clothes that they're wearing. Um, you also can see how the play is gendered. These are boys, not girls playing together with them. The women are back there, there are babies and whatnot. It's a photograph where a woman walking by, she seems to be the only one noticing what's going on, seems to say, oops. And I think one of the things this photo lets us understand is that if you were a woman and you had a camera, you had through the camera a license to stare. And you sort of blended in with all the other women. People didn't pay that much attention to you, especially kids then. And so we get to see how women saw the streets and what they chose to take pictures of there. Levitt was born in Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, grew up there, ended up leaving high school early. She didn't graduate. She really wanted to become a photographer. And was one of the few photographers to become quite successful. She has a show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1943 of children's photographs of children and stuff like that there.
I just wanted to mention,
Yeah.
the play space for kids, for poor kids, for immigrant kids is the street and
Yep.
the sidewalks. It's not cushy playgrounds. And I just want to point out in the right background, we see Walter Quay hand laundry, and it speaks to the different immigrants, Chinese American immigrants, and they're coming from the West Coast to New York City, and the multiracial ethnic nature of New York City that was occurring, building, and fascinated these photographers.
That's correct. And they were really committed to showing the mixed multiracial quality of the city. Yes, absolutely. They weren't interested in the rich people particularly, but in working class New Yorkers, yes. Okay. So here's a photo by Vivian Cherry, who comes to the Photo League after the war. She gives the Photo League, she gives this photo the title Yorkville Swastika. And she does so for specific political reasons. Yorkville was a neighborhood in Manhattan on the Upper East Side. It was heavily German. And in the years prior to World War II, it had the German-American Bund, which was partially financed by the Nazi Germany. And there were parades there. People wore brown shirts, and then further north in Italian Harlem, there were black-shirted people, men essentially marching in the street. So she wanted people looking at the photograph to remember the politics of what the war had been about, who the United States had defeated, Nazi Germany, and that, yeah, there were still swastikas being scrawled on the walls.
So of course, as Deborah has stated, the swastika and the boys are playing roughly. One seems to be hitting the other towards the head with some kind of stick or something. And they're in a rough, neglected area. And with the swastika again, the new representation for the first time of the Holocaust creeps in ways like this. A photograph that captures a haunting image, graffiti, but that shows both the anti-Semitism of the time and a reminder of the enemies who did also populate, as Deborah said, New York City.
Yeah. So here's another one that is more specific to survivors, Jewish survivors from the Holocaust. Sonia Handelman-Meyer also comes to the Photo League, during the war, actually, a little towards the end. She grew up in Queens, and she wanders into Hayes's headquarters on Lafayette Street, which is on the east side. It then became the place where Joe Papp set up his public theater a number of years later. And, she takes this photo of women and with some children and men waiting around. And it's not clear what they're waiting for. It's also pretty clear they're not paying any attention to her. It represents, I think, the consciousness in the Photo League of the war, of the Holocaust, of survivors who have now come to New York and are going to become New Yorkers there. I don't know what you think of this one, Diana, but
what strikes me the most is from the lower left almost to the upper right is this are these bars, and this man coming down the stairwell. It's separating a male and female space. The children are with the women. The women are waiting, and yet there's a purpose. It's not just hanging out on a park bench or chatting and watching the kids. They are there to move away from being survivors or victims into being survivors and Americans. So they had a really important job to do in taking care of and moving their children and family into being Americans.
Yeah, yeah. You do have the sense that the women are moving toward becoming Americans faster, it seems, than the men, and at least in this image. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So here's a form of waiting that I actually have a whole chapter on waiting in the book, because New Yorkers did it a lot. And the writer Jane Jacobs, used to talk about eyes on the street, which is partly what waiting is about. Because if you're out there on the street waiting, you're watching what's going on. And Jacobs contended that this is partly what made streets safe, with the fact that people hung out on them. Now, New York City ordinances didn't necessarily like people hanging out. They called that loitering. And they'd put up signs, no loitering, right? They'd stencil these signs around, which people, of course, ignored. And Lepkoff, like Rosenblum, grew up on the Lower East Side. This is Henry Street. It's near where she lived. And she would go, daily to the same streets. And so people knew her when she was taking photographs there. And I really love this photo because it just sort of captures the whole quality of doing the things that reformers didn't like people to do: hanging out, drinking a Coke, soda pop. The women are sitting on a bench outside the store, and talking to this man. It's really fun.
I like that it's all also gray tones. There's not, except for the women's hair, striking black or striking black and white. He's kind of taking a transitional tone in when he printed this. Oh my goodness, when she printed her photograph.
Yeah. No, that's right. It is beautiful grays. Okay, so I'm going to take us to Coney Island, right?
Yeah.
And okay, so Diana, you want to talk about Coney Island?
I do.
Okay.
I do.
Yeah.
We have photographs the 12 years apart. Coney Island, we all know, it was built for the rich and elite, but it became the middle and then the working class venue, place to get out of the hot city and hot tenements and go out and catch a breeze and gather together. Crowds were gathering, such as on the left, this crowd of young people who are all really intimately leaning on each other. The man who seems to be the most leaned on person has stripped down, has his shirt off. And the one on the right, Davidson had been attracted to stories of Puerto Rican gangs and young people in Brooklyn. And he followed them out to the beach. And we can see the difference between these two. On the left, we've got a crowded scene. They're all laughing. They're all happy. The one on the right, the two people, the young woman, the young man, are looking warily at Davidson. And it's also there right up front, so we confront them visually directly. Behind them is almost all empty beach. So it's not the fun-loving summer crowds, gathering together. It's more this isolation and exchange of views that strikes me about this. And the Photo League loved the Coney Island. it's a great place to watch people watch the spectacle of the city, the crowds of the city. And it's, I think, really significant. These people chose photography of this art as their art form, which is about viewing, seeing, capturing, and that brought them out to the public, which was on display.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add one or 2 points. Feinstein was a teenager when he took this photo. Like Engel, he started early. Coney Island was also his local beach. He was a Brooklyn kid. And so he tells a story about it where, somebody says, "Hey, mister, take my photo," which was sort of, people wanted to have their photo taken back then. And if you look really closely, you can see him in the eye, reflected in the sunglasses of the guy. Many, many years later, Feinstein became a successful photographer. This photo was published in Life, and someone wrote to him, a nephew, and said, "That's my aunt." And he said, "She's as beautiful today as she was then." So she was what, 17? Feinstein was 18. It was, and that's different. Davidson was already an adult. He'd already served in the military. He'd done other photo stories and there's a different attitude, I think, towards photography by the time you get into the late 50s. You can see it here in Leon Levinstein's photo, where we got men looking at women again, but the guy in the middle, he's staring right at Levinstein, and therefore he's staring, of course, at us. And Levinstein was a big guy. He came to New York, grew up in Baltimore, comes to New York after the war. He's already an adult, takes up photography then. It has this different voyeur feeling to it, with the 3 men and the backs of the 2 women there. I don't know if you have any comments about the sort of the tension that's in this particular photograph. Yeah.
Yes, I think tension is a great word. We have this man in the middle, tattooed, which was kind of a outsider status thing, not
Absolutely.
every day as it seems to be. He's looking, there are 2 women, and instead of a portrait where you're turned, you're posed, you're looking at the photographer, their backs, the back of their heads are captured, and they're almost like a barricade. We look through and see this exchange of glances by the men. And I think that the man with the cigarette at the middle and the fedora, who's kind of framed, is looking out at Levinstein. At least that's my view is that
I think so too.
Out.
Yeah. He's not looking at the women. He's looking at Levinstein. Yeah.
What he's up to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's wrap it up now with oh, I forgot we had this one. Okay. I have this one by Modell. She is a photographer who comes to New York from Europe. And she's fascinated by the plate glass. And this is, one of these pictures. She did a whole series of what she calls reflections on the plate glass. And this is indeed one of them. And it's great because it's hard to know what's inside, what's outside. There's clearly a man looking in, and he gets reflected. But this was taken downtown on the west side of Manhattan there. And it has a very different kind of feel, although she was also involved with the Photo League. But she comes to photography already, again, as an adult in Europe, with a different response to New York City there.
And she again is captured as other photographers have captured. She's not in the store. She's out on the street. I'm getting my pronouns mixed up. The man looking in, the hats on display, all these different signs that are inside. He seems to be in between 2 uh, windows that extend out, and he's kind of sandwiched between them, and all the reflections in the buildings, and it makes a beautiful play of imagery and of light against dark, which is the tonalities and the basis of photography and here used on the street. I also want to point out the dates, since we are, well, we're
we move
mainly
back.
talking about Jewish photographers, not Modell. But this is when the war is ramping up, when the Holocaust is ramping up, when people are starting out. So the Jewish photographers knew, as many Jews knew, that it was going to be perilous times. And I think that impacted on them.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. Okay, so this one is another one by Levitt, and it's sort of our penultimate, right? So you wanted to comment a bit on this photo by Levitt,
Yeah,
Diana? Yeah,
I love this photo.
me too.
There's this facade or frieze of the different men, the four men. I love that the man's back, very muscular, is pointed to the camera and seems to be holding on and looking at something, whereas the man who's dressed up and with the tie is looking out. The man seated on the stoop is looking in the other direction. They're all outside the public sphere, which was, if we talked about gender, Levitt knew that the outside was the public sphere, was the male sphere. And here we have this young girl framed against black, inside in the more domestic space, kind of daydreaming and looking out towards the street. And her glance just again reinforces the importance of the street for action and also for play.
Right. Okay. And so I want to show this other one because it's like so cool. You know, they all turned around. They're all interacting with her. And it's, you know, it invites one to say, gee, did she take this first? Did she take it second? You know, we don't know. I mean, you know, we can imagine a dialogue. The guy says, all right, you want me to turn around? I'll turn around, you know, all right. Sure, I'll look off down the way. Right. Or
Right.
maybe it was afterwards. And they said, well, did you get it? You know, and it's how'd it come out? Right. Obviously, in those days, nobody knew how it came out until you actually went and developed the film. And, you know, so it's not like today where people have instant gratification.
Right.
So, yeah. So thank you very much, Diana. This was really fun. And I think, you know, we're open for questions. I will stop sharing unless people want to talk about a specific photo there.
I want to say before we move into questions, thank you to you both for that really amazing presentation and all those really cool images. So thank you for that. And for those of you who are out there, if you want to continue to share questions in the Q&A, please continue to do so. But I want to start with a question that came in. That's wondering if you can just go into a little bit more depth about the history of the Photo League, which you talked about a lot, and just maybe give us just a little bit more detail about that.
Sure. I mean, I can start, and then you can fill in. So the Photo League was preceded by something called the Film and Photo League, that was existed in a number of cities around the United States. It had initially started in Germany, where it was called the Workers' Film and Photo League. So it was very much a left-wing organization to try to encourage the use of cameras to help persuade people and to see the world as working class people did. In New York City, the film people and the photo people split apart in the early 30s. And the film people went off by themselves, as it were. And the photo people in 36 thought they would create this co-op. And this is where Sid Grossman and Saul Leibson become really influential, because Grossman gives this impassioned speech and said, no, we should be open to amateurs. We shouldn't just be for professionals. And yeah, we should be a co-op, but let's include everybody, who people have jobs where they don't find opportunities for self-expression and stuff. And so many of the professionals just left, and they set up themselves across the street, and the Photo League evolved from there. And one of the most important things it did as a co-op is it set up classes. And so it had darkroom facilities and places where you could also print. And since you were using these shared spaces, you were also getting people's comments. And this is a place where lots of New York Jews, it wasn't completely Jewish, but it was sort of this kind of New York Jewish space that was secular but shared. And you had to feel comfortable among Jews to join the Photo League because they were the majority. Yeah.
I just want to add one thing. I don't think we've talked about it. It's 36. This is the time of the Popular Front.
Yes.
This is when the far left becomes more open to Democrats, democracy, less strident. And so more and more people are becoming involved on the left. And I think there's no accident that this is 36 of the Photo League and 36 of the Popular Front. It's all part of the same air that they're all breathing, pursuing. And the photography is stressing democratic values of kind of like Whitman, of the people and finding the people, and the city streets. There's a real harmony with that.
Yes, and I should add one more thing. I'm sorry.
Please, yeah, no, please.
But the Photo League is shut down in 51 as a result of the anti-communist. It's put on the Attorney General's list in November of 47. They try to fight it. They get, variety of well-known non-Jewish photographers to join and be supportive and stuff, and they don't succeed. And so too many people feel that if they join, they're going to be labeled a communist, irrespective of what their politics are. And they're too nervous. And so the league closes in 51. So it's just 15 years.
Thank you. So another question that came in is asking about, so you talked about how a lot of these photographs show the different gender roles that women and men are kind of fitting into at this time, but also how some gender roles are beginning to break down in a way, how some women were entering the workforce in certain times. So you also noted a lot of female photographers. So were any of the women who were taking these photographs getting pushback for entering into this space, or were they welcomed by the Photo League and by the people they were taking photos of?
So the women were certainly welcomed in the Photo League. I mean, there was a social element to it, and there were a number of marriages that occurred through the Photo League, right? People met and they shared an interest in photography. And, I mean, I didn't show Dan Wiener or Sandra Wiener's stuff, but that was one of the couples. And, and so, no, the Photo League did not push back against women. I mean, someone like Lepkov remembers, a policeman coming up to her and saying, "Hey, what are you doing in this neighborhood? It's dangerous." And she said, "Don't worry," and she had interactions with people who objected to her being on the street with a camera. One guy saying, "Give me the film. You don't have the right to take my picture and stuff and whatnot." But that's not from fellow photographers. No. Yeah.
Thank
you. Diana, do you have anything you want to add before I go on?
I just want to point out again, a lot of the photographs were taken with the people unaware. So there's not like a formal, now we have to like acknowledge, get signed papers that you're letting me use your image. It was more of a casual exchange or unrecognized by the people on the street.
Thank you. So another question that came in is asking about your research process for this book, Deborah. Maybe if you could go into a little bit of how you found all these photographs and things like that.
All right. So I spent a long time working on this book. And it started actually with an earlier book that I wrote together with another scholar, Howard Rock. The book was called Cityscapes, A History of New York in Images. And I had the second half of the book. And I decided I'm going to use photographs for the second half of the book, which ran from the late 19th through the 20th century. And we didn't have any money for permissions. Yeah, you need to pay for permissions for photographs. We had $25, which even back then was like nothing, right? So we would write to these photographers and say, we'd like to use, publish your photograph, but we only had $25 per photo, and some photographers just said, forget it. No, Other photographers, though, said, where'd you see my work? And I'd say, okay, Museum of the City of New York, the New York Public Library, the standard places. Oh, they said, you've only seen a small amount. Why don't you come to my studio? So I started going to people's studios around New York. And after a while, it began to dawn on me, oh, this one's Jewish. Oh, that one's Jewish. Oh, the other one's Jewish. I was going to one, and the Jewishness of who they were and stuff became really apparent. And that was the beginning of the project, was like, oh, I'm going to do something on these Jewish photographers, because I had seen a lot of their work in their studios and everything. And so I did a bunch of interviews as well. And in the meantime, because it took me so long, other people were working on it. There was an exhibit at the Jewish Museum that Kozlov, you mentioned Kozlov, right?
Right.
Was involved with New York, the capital of photography. So he speaks about a bunch of these photographers. And then later there was another one that was basically on the Photo League called the Radical Camera, that emphasized the radicalness of this rather than the Jewishness of it. And so, I drew upon those sources as well. But much of it came from actually meeting a bunch of these photographers. Oh, and I should mention, however, there's one gallery, Howard Greenberg Gallery, and Howard was very generous, and he said, yeah, you want to look at stuff? And he had fallen in love with these photographers' work back in the 70s, late 70s, and he had a ton of stuff. And, I wasn't going to buy a photograph, but he just let me look. And that was great. And, I think, I don't know, around 25 of the photos are courtesy Howard Greenberg Gallery in the book.
Great.
That's
This
amazing.
is so great.
Yeah.
So another question that came in, and I apologize if you did address this in the presentation, but were many of these photographers immigrants themselves, or were they born in the United States?
No, most of them were born in the US. They were children of immigrants, right? So that meant that they were born in New York, they grew up in New York, they knew the streets as kids, they played, they went to public schools. Most of them graduated high school, not everybody. So no, they were not immigrants. These were native New Yorkers. Yeah.
Diana, you looked like you had something you wanted to add.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing.
Okay. Amazing. So another question that we got is asking if you see the influence of these photographers in other Jewish photographers working today, or even sort of in the decades sort of after you are talking about in this book.
Diana, you want to answer that one?
No, I'll be honest, my area is the 1930s and 40s. I do not know the contemporary photography scene, so I really can't say, but I would say there was an influence I see that was on the Farm Security Administrator photographers, Dorothea Lange, Ben Shahn. There are many Jewish photographers who worked for the Farm Security Administration, documenting the devastation of the Dust Bowl, more rural than urban. But I really can't speak fully to the question. It's a great question, though.
So I'll add a little bit. Someone like Modell becomes a teacher, and she's a teacher of Diane Arbus. She's a teacher also of a number of other photographers. There's a wonderful contemporary photographer. Her name is Marcia Bricker Halperin, who does street photography. She just published a book about cafeterias, about Dubrow's cafeterias.
You can buy that at the museum shop.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. Now, granted, she's taking these photographs in the 70s and 80s, when cafeterias were popular. But she's still alive and, does still take photos. I think that there are some other photographers. I would mention Arlene Gottfried, who died a couple of years ago, who do street photography, but also take it in. They do other forms as well. They do family work. I mean, Gottfried has a really powerful book called Mommy, which is about 3 generations of Jewish women: her grandmother, her mother, and her sister. And a number of those photos are taken inside, some are taken outdoors and everything. So there is, a continuity. Feinstein teaches in Philadelphia as well, for a while in the 60s and I believe in the 70s also. So Rosenblum teaches at Brooklyn College. Jerome Lieblum, whom I didn't show, goes on to teach out at Minnesota and then at Hampshire. So I think that those are the connections with photographers. Is the Photo League ends, but the idea of teaching and the values that are taught are really important in terms of what is it that's worth taking a photograph of.
Mhm.
That's an important question. Okay?
Yeah. And I'll just mention that we had someone write in who took a course with Saul Libson as well.
Okay. Right.
That's great.
That's great. That's great. Yeah.
Write down your memories.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we are coming to the end of our time, but I do just want to make sure I ask this one last question. If people want to learn more about photography in this era, Jewish photographers, besides reading your amazing book, do you have any other resources that either of you can recommend?
Well, I think Deborah mentioned a couple other books. What I love about this book, I'm going to say, is I'm an art historian. Deborah's an art historian, and she crosses over beautifully. So she plays well with other disciplines.
Thank you, Diana.
Yes. Keep your eye out for the Museum of the City of New York for exhibitions. They have incredible resources. New York Historical Society, Brooklyn Historical Society, they really have rich collections that it's not often known, but you can make an appointment sometime and see some of these works. Also, I just read today, New York Public Library has a huge infusion of Jewish history, documents, what we call visual culture, art and photography, and the visual. And it's online. You can access all of this. We're talking thousands of images.
Yeah,
so
that's wonderful.
I'd go there also.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank you both again for this really excellent presentation, for answering all of these questions, and for taking the time to be here with us this evening. It was truly a pleasure to listen to both of you. And I want to echo what Diana said and highly encourage all of you to purchase walkers in the city, which you can do at the link in the chat. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events.